Between 1939 and 1952, Crosley was an upstart U.S. auto manufacturer specializing in small vehicles with engines less than 1 liter, and in their short life, they largely left absolutely no mark on their industry. And yet their story is completely fascinating. This is a far too brief history of Crosley Motors. So welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I am John, and honestly, I'd never heard of Crosley before until a couple of weeks ago. I was reading an article about appliances, of all things, and what I found was one of the most interesting tales of entrepreneurship that I've ever heard of a man whose life and whose business touched almost everyone in the early 1900s, the United States and around the world, and had an outsized influence on World War II as well. This video will eventually be about the cars, but first you need to hear the story of Crosley, where they came from, and the story of Powell Crosley and his brother Louis. Now, Powell Crosley was born in 1886. His younger brother Louis was born in 1888 in Cincinnati, Ohio. And together they created an economic empire where Powell was the innovator and the marketer, and Louis was the businessman largely behind the scenes. Powell's desire to be involved in the auto industry started as a teenager, and in 1900 he made a friendly wager with his father for over $10 that he could build a vehicle that would go 1 city block. Now, that is not an insignificant amount of money, because $10 back then is the equivalent of about $350 today. As a foreshadowing of their future business relationship, Powell went to his younger brother, who had been frugal with his money, borrowed the money. He went to his grandfather, got a wagon, went to a local theater, got a battery, and then designed and built his own electric motor. He put his younger, lighter brother behind the tiller, and the car went 1 city block and back again. And Powell collected his winnings and paid off his brother and paid off his suppliers. He went to college for engineering, but changed to law to satisfy his father, and after dropping out in 1907, he actually raised the money to form the Marathon 6 Automotive Company and build a prototype of a 6-cylinder car he intended to sell for $1,700. Unfortunately, this was the time of a deep economic recession, and the company ended up folding when the money dried up. The dream of making cars didn't die, but it took a back seat to his life, and Powell moved to Indianapolis and went to work for a large car dealership operated by a man by the name of Carl Fisher. Now, Fisher was the man behind the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the Indianapolis 500, and Powell struck up a friendship with this man. He learned business, he learned marketing, he learned promotion from him. And he got to be in and around cars. Now, he said in his life that he had a chance to be a driver at the Indianapolis 500. Other stories say he was not quite as close as he thought he was, so we don't know exactly where that was. But he got to stay in and around cars. Now, he had a lot of different jobs. He ended up being a chauffeur, he sold bonds, he worked for a couple other auto manufacturers, including doing promotion for them. But he had a sweetheart back in Cincinnati. And by about 1910 or so, she was getting a little tired of waiting. So he moved back to Cincinnati, got married, began a family, and he had one more shot at building an auto manufacturing company. At the time, it was called a 2-seater DeCross sidecar, which was a little weird. It had the driver behind the passenger in a line. It didn't really work out, and he ended up doing a bunch of other things, including selling advertising. Now, by 1916, one of Crosley's largest advertising clients was a gentleman by the name of Ira Cooper of Cooper Tires. Now, with the exploding number of automobiles in the world, there was a lot of blowouts, a lot of used tires. Cooper would retread tires, but he increasingly had all this rubber left over and didn't have anything to do with it because the tread was too far gone to reuse. Inspired by this, Crosley invented a liner that actually went inside the tire but before the inner tube and acted as a sort of reinforcement or an armor to help prevent the puncture of the inner tube, and he called it the inside tire. Together with Cooper, they started the American Automobile Accessory Company. Now, Crosley later bought out Cooper and brought in his brother Louis into the business. Powell discovered he had a knack for finding needed accessories and create products for them, and his brother had the gift of producing them at a very high quality while also making a profit. This ended up being a 3-decade formula for success for the brothers. This included tire patches, fuel additives, and one of the more famous items was a flag holder that would actually clamp onto a radiator cap, and it sold well as the nation and patriotism, immediately before World War I. Another critical decision was to sell their products through a franchise model of independent dealerships. We'll mention this point again later on. And by 1919, they'd sold more than $1 million in products, and they were looking to expand beyond accessories. Now, one of the early ones was the phonograph. Initially, RCA had a patent on the phonograph, and they would cost about $100 at a time when a weekly salary might be $12. When the patent ran out, Crosley saw an opportunity, and by early 1920, they'd introduced the Amarinola, costing half of RCA's machines. Sales were strong, and the next year they found one of their biggest opportunities. Now, the legend has it that Powell's son asked for a toy radio, and they went to the store and they found out it cost $130. And so instead of buying himself a radio, he got a 25-cent pamphlet called The ABCs of Radio. He and his son decided that they would build their own, and with about $25 in parts, they did so. And Powell immediately saw the opportunity here. He actually hired 2 college students to help design a low-cost unit that could be mass-produced, and in 1921 they introduced the Harco, selling for just $7. Soon, Crosley Radio Corporation was making radio components for others as well as their own line of radios, and by 1925, Crosley was the largest manufacturer of radios in the world. Now, after releasing his radios, Crosley realized the next market was broadcasting, because what would drive the sale of radios was more content. At first, he broadcast from his house. He actually set up a radio transmitter at his house, and he played his own record collection. In 1922, Crosley Broadcasting Corporation got a commercial license to operate WLW on a 50-watt transmitter, and they proceeded to design and build a station. By 1928, they became the first 50-kilowatt station in the U.S. with a regular schedule, and in 1935, they installed a 500-kilowatt transmitter, making them temporarily the world's most powerful for the next 5 years. And through the 1930s, WLW brought popular entertainers of the day and produced hours of weekly content. Interestingly, they also experimented with television, and in 1929 they received an experimental TV license, but they really didn't do anything with it until Crosley sold the company later on. Again, recognizing a business opportunity, Crosley combined 2 ventures, radio and sports. In 1934, Crosley bought the struggling Cincinnati Reds. Now, the previous owner had lost much of his fortune in the 1929 economic recession, and the team was near bankruptcy and threatening to leave Cincinnati. Crosley bought it to save it. Now, it's unclear to me if Crosley planned for installing lighting at the stadium or if those plans preceded him buying the team, but in 1935, the first nighttime game in MLB history was held, and it boosted attendance by more than a factor of 4. Financials improved, and Crosley began the first regularly scheduled play-by-play broadcasts of all games on his station. Within 5 years, all major teams had radio broadcasts. In 1929, Crosley had ventured into aircraft manufacture, but the Depression halted any planned production, and afterwards a planned plane had a series of crashes that kind of ruined its reputation. It was abandoned. Also in the 30s, Crosley added refrigerators and other appliances to their product line. They developed the Icy Ball, which was a non-electric refrigeration device. In 1932, Crosley had the now obvious idea to put shelves in the doors of refrigerators, and his new 1933 Shelvador was a hit. But overall, the appliances really weren't the big success they thought it was going to be, struggling against so many other brands out there. Not every product they released was a success. The appliances were modestly successful, and furnaces and other products like hair growth never really took off. But no one failure was big enough to threaten the organization. And finally, we get to the cars. Crosley never forgot his love of cars and his desire to be an auto manufacturer. In 1936, he approached his brother about the idea of entering the auto industry. And surprisingly, Louis said no, because he thought it was too risky, too much money. So Powell decided to use his own not inconsiderable fortune to found Crosley Motors. Powell had purchased an Austin 7 many years before and used it at one of his properties, and it was a small, simple economy car intended for mass appeal, and he felt the same formula would work in the US as well. And in 1939, he introduced the 1A, a compact car with a cloth roof just 10 feet long and on an 80-inch wheelbase, and with an air-cooled 2-cylinder engine by Waukesha. I hope I pronounced that correct. A maker of truck and tractor motors. And at $325, his cars were cheaper than a similar-sized Bantam. They got up to 50 miles per gallon at 50 miles per hour, and the updated A2 and the lineup expanded to include both a panel van and pickup models in 1940. Interestingly, Crosley didn't use a traditional auto dealership network. They already had a network of over 25,000 appliance dealers, and these small cars could actually be rolled right into the store and sold right next to the refrigerators and the radios. But the war put a stop to car production, and Crosley turned to wartime production after making a total of 5,757 cars. In the war effort, Crosley made radio transceivers and multiple other related products, as well as field kitchens, air conditioning units, gun turrets, trailers, and more for the war effort. The fledgling auto manufacturer produced many experimental vehicles such as motorcycles, tricycles, tracked vehicles, self-propelled gun, and a single-passenger four-wheel drive vehicle that was air-droppable called the CT3 Pup that was deployed in limited numbers but ultimately canceled. Most notably, Crosley was tapped to work on a top-secret project. In fact, it was so secret that Powell and Louis did not have the necessary security clearance to know what a department in his company was actually doing until after the war ended. That product was the proximity fuse, which used radio signals to tell the ordnance when it was close to its target and to detonate. First used at Guadalcanal in 1943, General Patton once remarked, quote, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." At war's end, they were the top producer of the fuses and made several design improvements, and the fuse was considered the third most important product of the war after the A-bomb and radar. Who knew? Another critical invention that they made during the war played a major part in their post-war auto plans. They had developed from someone else's design a copper-brazed sheet metal engine called the Cobra that was inexpensive, light, and extremely cheap to make. And it was used in multiple products throughout the war, including generators, pumps, refrigeration units, a small plane, and many of Crosley's own products. After the war, Powell turned his attention back to automobiles, and in 1945 he sold all of his companies to Aviation Corporation, Avco, keeping only the Cincinnati Reds and Crosley Motors for himself. The 1946 Crosley CC4 was slightly larger and more an aerodynamic model, but used that new sheet metal Cobra engine, but used the same chassis, suspension, brakes, and other parts from their pre-war models. Brother Louis argued against the use of the Cobra engine. Now, he had had some engineering training, and the 724cc straight 4 unit was water-cooled, made 26.5 horsepower, which produced twice the horsepower of their pre-war engine, had an overhead cam, and in Navy tests and in usage proved to be extremely reliable. However, automotive use was going to be very different than what the engine was designed for. Running a air conditioning unit or a generator at a nice constant RPM, a constant speed for hours on end is very different than starting up, driving a car, RPMs increase, RPMs decrease, and owners would not have the benefit of the military's very rigorous maintenance schedule. Lewis thought this engine would be very troublesome, recommended they not use it, but Powell did not listen, and unfortunately Lewis was correct. It ended up being very susceptible to corrosion, proved to be very troublesome, and very quickly tarnished Crosley's reputation. The CC was sold until 1948 and included a convertible as well as a pickup truck, a panel van, and a station wagon version. While often referred to as tiny, they had adequate legroom for people over 6 feet, but they were extremely narrow. As post-war restrictions on materials were lifted, Crosley's sales began to rise, and they sold 19,000 cars in 1947 and 29,000 in 1948. In 1949, the CC was replaced with the CD, with changes to the bodywork and an ongoing revision through the model's life until 1952. The biggest change was the replacement of that troublesome Cobra engine with a new cast iron engine named the CIBA, the cast iron block assembly. Still, Crosley engineers had to be different, and this engine had the combustion chambers, the valve seats, the cam supports, the ports, all cylinders, all in one casting, and the crankcase in another. It was still 724 cc and produced the same 26.5 horsepower. Also in 1949, they introduced a sports car called the Hotshot. Now, using this new CIBA engine, it was on a new and longer wheel-based frame. It weighed only 1,095 pounds, and it was easy to remove the top, side curtains, and windscreen and get that weight down to 991 pounds and go take it racing. Still, with that 26.5 horsepower new engine, it was capable of 80 miles an hour and performed well in races and in 6 and 12-hour races over the year. Remember, this was introduced 4 years before the Corvette and 8 years before the famous Bug-Eye Sprite, and it was the first modern American car with four-wheel disc brakes. In 1950, they offered a super sport model of this with a slightly larger engine at 748 cc's and higher compression, and aftermarket add-ons sprung up, including hotter camshafts, ignitions, and even a supercharger that could together boost power to about 60 horsepower. In 1950, Crosley wanted to appeal more to commercial and agricultural markets, and with their experience from the war with the pup, they introduced the Farm-O-Road. Had a 63-inch wheelbase, 48 inches wide, and it's comparable in size to a modern side-by-side, but it was also street legal and offered a power takeoff and a low range mode. It also offered options such as dual rear wheels, removable pickup bed, and attachments like plows, snowplow, mower, cultivator, hay rake, seeders, and much more, including an available steel front skis that strapped to the front tires and could turn the Farm-O-Road into a snowmobile. By the 1950s, the price war was on. The better equipped cars from the big three fought for buyers, and this led to a lot of low-priced used cars kind of flooding the market and taking sales from Crosley. They sold only 4,839 in 1951 and 1,522 in 1952. The final Crosley was produced on July 3rd, 1952, and in total they sold all of 84,000 vehicles. The engine plant was sold, and that last engine was modified multiple times and used in sports cars, including a double overhead cam design and maritime uses all the way up to 1972. In conclusion, Crosley had a short life as an auto manufacturer, but brought several innovations to their cars. Consider they were the first affordable mass-market car with an overhead cam in 1946, the first use of the term sports utility, the first post-war sports car in 1949, and the first American car with that four-wheel caliper-type disc brakes. Many of these histories I've done highlight the post-war era and how anyone could sell anything after the war until the price war between GM and Ford drove many manufacturers either straight out of business or into mergers like what created AMC. Crosley's small cars were released at the wrong time, and it can be argued they never had a chance to survive with the changes in the market and limited development funds. But is that really true? They showed surprising innovation, especially in exploring new markets with the Hotshot and the Farm-O-Road, but the time was not on their side. That sheet metal engine they decided to go with ruined a reliability reputation, and its replacement was extremely durable, but it was too little too late. However, there's a tantalizing thought that I just can't shake. What if Crosley had not been launched in the US? They sold Crosleys around the world, not very successfully, but as a European company, the small cars would have been better accepted, the small engines would have been considered more desirable, and the sometimes innovative marketing position could have set them apart. It's not a stretch to see Crosley producing vehicles in another market that became icons, such as the 2CV, the 500, or the Beetle, and others achieved. While Americans moved away from small cars in the 40s, early 50s, in 1953 the VW Beetle came back to the US, and by 56 they were selling over 40,000. Could Crosley have held on, updated, and been there to reap the benefits as US buyers started to move to smaller and more fuel-efficient cars? I guess that's a question for the future to ponder, but we can look back and celebrate the amazing life and business success of the Crosley Brothers and that small 13-year history of bringing innovative and really interesting vehicles to the US. Let me know what you think below, guys. I appreciate you being here.